Since starting this channel just over a year ago, I've spoken at length about the various things I'm passionate about, including various video games, Star Trek, or the Evangelion franchise. One thing that I'm yet to touch on is my love of wrestling. Much like video games and Star Trek, this is something that goes back as far as I can remember. For as long as I've recalled, I've always enjoyed watching wrestling. I'd say that my love of it comes primarily from my parents, mainly my mum, who grew up watching it herself at local town hall events. She watched it during the ITV World of Sport era, and then migrated to what was then known as the WWF, which we of course know now as WWE. So I myself was born in 1987, and during those formative years, I was exposed to wrestling. I definitely remember it being on TV in the background. I remember certain names coming and going, but it wouldn't really be until I'd say about 93, 94 that I truly started to know who certain wrestlers were. And my earliest memories of any matches do date back to those years. So I always do tend to say that my love of wrestling started just at the end of the Hulkamania Rock and Wrestling era and the start of what was known back then as the new generation. I think my earliest thing with wrestling wasn't even known a match as such, but it was actually a tape cassette I had, which had the Wrestlemania theme song on it, which was being sung by various stars of the time. It was bloody awful, as you would expect it to be, but as a kid, I don't think you care about things like that, and it did get a lot of playtime. Wrestler-wise, I think the earliest ones I really remember watching from that era, ones like The Undertaker, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, I remember Yokozuna, Doink the Clown, Diesel, Razor Ramon, now that sort of batch. Match-wise, probably the earliest one that I remember that sticks out would be Undertaker versus Undertaker at SummerSlam 1994, and another one that sticks out would be Bob Backlund's reign as the champion for some reason. Of course, as years went on and we moved into 97, 98, things would become a lot more tangible. WWF moved from the New Generation era to the Attitude era. We would see the rise of stars like Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock. We'd see groups like D-Generation X. The Undertaker was given more of an edge. It introduced his brother Kane, and wrestling in general exploded in popularity, for not just in part because of the stars mentioned above. But because of the efforts of WWF's rival promotion, WCW. So it was around this time that I myself owned a PlayStation, and of course, with wrestling being as big as it was, and me being as big a fan as I was, I owned a number of wrestling games over the years. So this brings us to the subject of today's video. It's a combination of two things I absolutely love: wrestling, video games. I thought that it would be fun to take a look at the various wrestling games on offer on one of my favourite platforms of all time, the PlayStation 1. Now, it does seem that there were quite a lot released on that platform. I think there's far too many to cover in one video. So what I've done is I'm going to split it up for now into the two main companies at the time, WWF, WCW. In this one, we're going to take a look at all the WWF video games released on the PlayStation 1. For our first game, we're going to travel all the way back to 1995. It was a year that gave us Cotton Eye Joe and Shaggy's Bombastic, a year in which Celine Dion asked us to think twice, and two blokes from the telly called Robson and Jerome had quite a big run in the charts. There were two bands called Oasis and Blur battling out for chart supremacy. The year would start with E17 asking us to stay another day, and end with Michael Jackson stuck between two trees, singing about elephants. The album of the year would be Welcome to the Neighborhood by Meatloaf. This is a fact, and not at all my own personal bias. Gaming-wise, 1995 saw the release of one of the greatest JRPGs of all time, Chrono Trigger. We saw the start of the Command & Conquer franchise. Games like Earthbound came out, Worms, Panzer Dragoon. We saw the American and European launches of the Sony Playstation, which had launched in Japan back in December of 94. In the world of wrestling, we were firmly in the new generation era. Wrestlemania that year was headlined by Bam Bam Bigelow against Lawrence Taylor, and your championship match was Diesel defeating Shawn Michaels. 95 is seen as a little bit of a bad year for the WWF. There was a King of the Ring which crowned Mabel in a push that never really went anywhere, but 1995 would see the debut of one Hunter Hearst Helmsley in a WWF ring. So let's talk about the game itself. WWF Wrestlemania is a far cry from the wrestling games we have nowadays. It's got a very slim roster of just 8, and it plays much more like a traditional fighting game. It was released across a number of platforms. It was released in the arcades, hence the name WrestleMania, the arcade game. It also came to the SNES, the Mega Drive, the 32X, the Saturn, and the PC. So there's a huge crossover there of, sort of two kind of generations clashing, and also sort of mid-generation point there with the 32X. Now, how do I feel about it? To be completely honest, I didn't really get along with it. I've never been into more traditional fighting games. I've never been good at them either. This game plays much more like Mortal Kombat or a Street Fighter, but with a bit of a wrestling twist. It's quite cool to be able to traverse a bit more of a 3D plane back then. It kind of feels like a sort of a Streets of Rage type direction and control. You have things like the ropes to bounce off of, but what you really get here is more of a fighting game than a wrestling game, especially the ones we would come to know. The roster itself isn't too bad though. It does represent some of the bigger known stars of that era. You've got Doink, The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, Razor Ramon, Yokozuna, Bam Bam Bigelow, and Lex Luger. The single player gives you a choice of path, and from there you just sort of play these matches, moving from one to the other. It does play quite weirdly for my taste. It has a few sort of special moves in there. Not that I ever really figured out how to do them. I'm so used to the more modern wrestling games, I just kind of found it really hard to get the grips of it. But I do imagine for the time it was decent, and from what I've seen, looking at the reception around the time, it was seen to be quite decent. The PlayStation version scored fairly well, and GamePro actually gave it an award for the best 32X game of 1995. Not that I imagine there was much competition back on 32X back then, but an award is an award. 1996, Take That would announce they were splitting up, breaking the hearts of teenagers up and down the country. Gina G wanted just a little bit more, and the very first iteration of Three Lions, which I can imagine many people in the UK and at all fed up of hearing over the last few months, would be released. And then the Spice Girls would tell us what they wanted, what they really, really wanted. Wrestling-wise, we saw a returning Ultimate Warrior come back to the WWF to squash Triple H before he would bugger off again. We would see the boyhood dream come true as Shawn Michaels would beat Bret Hart in a 60-minute Iron Man match. We would see the WWF debut of one, the Ringmaster, and we got to wonder whatever became of him. WWF was still suffering during this time. The ratings weren't great, and July 1996 would start to see the meteoric rise of their competition, WCW, as the NWO stable formed, making its debut off the back of Hulk Hogan turning heel. But there'll be more on WCW in another video. Now, unlike its predecessor, In Your House was not released in arcades. It only saw release on the PlayStation, the Sega Saturn, and MS-DOS, strangely enough. The game itself plays very much like WrestleMania the arcade game, and at risk of sounding like a broken record, it means I didn't get along with it. It's another strange game. It leans much more into the arcade fighting game style, and your matches don't even really take place in a ring or a proper arena. You've got varying settings like a desert or a crypt. In this, you have 3 different paths to pick from: a WWF season, Intercontinental Championship, and World Heavyweight Championship. Roster-wise, the list has been bumped up to 10. It again represents who was in WWF at the time. Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, and Bret Hart return, but they're now joined by Ahmed Johnson, Goldust, Ultimate Warrior, Vader, Owen Hart, British Bulldog, and Triple H. Once again, I really struggled to figure out what I was doing here beyond just running at my enemies or hitting them with my bum. Critically, this one seems to have done a little bit worse than WrestleMania. Many critics actually kind of ignored it. It does seem that Acclaim were facing various difficulties at the time, which might have contributed to critics ignoring it. Maybe copies weren't sent out there. But this one certainly does seem to have got a more negative reception than WrestleMania the arcade game. Let's move on then to 1998, the release of WWF Warzone. So we didn't get a game in 1997, it seemed to have skipped a year. So 1997 had gone by, WWF had started to change a little bit. Gone were a new generation, instead we were being told all about Attitude. A number of stars had moved on from WWF to the competition, and now we were seeing new stars being built up, just about ready to make their mark. 97 saw the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin. He was poised, ready to break through to that next level. We started to see the work of Rocky Maivia, who would go on to become The Rock. We saw the formation of a legendary stable as Triple H and Shawn Michaels joined forces. Wrestling as a whole was becoming a bit darker, a little bit more edgier, and dare I say it, a little bit cooler. 1998 would really see things explode though. Stone Cold Steve Austin would have an amazing first half of the year. He started it by winning the Royal Rumble, then he would go on to unseat Shawn Michaels as a champion at Wrestlemania, starting to cement his legacy as one of the greatest of all time. Rocky Maivia had become The Rock. He would start to establish himself as an all-time great, having a feud over the summer with Triple H over the Intercontinental Championship. We would see Triple H take over as the leader of D-Generation X. He'd bring in new recruits like X-Pac, the New Age Outlaws, to form what I'd say is probably the most well-known iteration of that stable. The Undertaker would start to flourish a bit more in this era. He'd show a darker side. He'd show even a bit more of a more human side as he feuded with his on-screen brother Kane, and then in the middle of the year would have that famous match with Mick Foley, who was wrestling back then as Mankind at King of the Ring. It was a Hell in a Cell match that I think we've all seen numerous times by now. Of course, you had the villainous Mr. McMahon, now turned fully heel after the infamous Montreal Screwjob. Their rival WCW was doing great business with their own product. 97, 98, you saw the NWO flourish. You saw them start to build up this Bill Goldberg, who had gone on an amazing winning streak. Oh, and if you were wondering, back in 1998, Celine Dion had returned as her heart kept going on. Three Lions came back for the 1998 World Cup. Cher would introduce us to auto-tune as an instrument. The album of the year, Very Best of Meatloaf. Again, no personal bias there. So let's talk about the game itself. WWF Warzone was released on the PlayStation, the N64, and the Game Boy. It was released around the middle of the year. It did see a shift from the previous two titles. It was less arcade, fighting game-like, and now they were trying to emulate an actual wrestling match. Now, Warzone was the first wrestling game I ever played. I got it around my birthday in December of that year. I was really hyped for it. So what I'll start off by saying is that it does feel very much more like a wrestling game. Gone are the arcade styles of the previous ones. It becomes a more grounded game that makes an attempt to feel like a wrestling match. It is not without its flaws. Pulling off moves can be quite tricky in it. Each move corresponds to a button combo, such as left, right, circle, down, right, square. Each wrestler has their own set of moves, and you'll find that you are going to the in-game move list quite often to remind yourself how things are done. But for my money, it is a fun game, especially compared to the previous two. Now, I do know that might be a lot of nostalgia talking, but I had a lot of fun playing it again. I did a few matches, I was able to get along with the controls really well, and it just put a smile on my face. Now, of note in Warzone, this was the first WWF title to include the Create a Wrestler feature. It's fairly basic compared to what you get now, but I do remember back in the day downloading and printing off loads of character formulas from the internet to help me create a vast number of characters ranging from wrestlers that hadn't made the cut to the game, to who were in other promotions, to comic book characters like Spider-Man or Batman. In this, we start to see a more expanded roster representing some of the big stars of the Attitude Era. There's probably a few too many to list, but you'll see it on screen now. You'll see returning faves like Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Undertaker, and you'd see upcoming stars like Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Mankind. It wasn't the biggest roster, but it was a good chunk of who you would see on TV at the time. A little bit more notable is the game's career mode, which would allow you to take control of a superstar and fight from the lower levels up to your championship. The mode is perhaps well known as well for the awkward and sometimes incomprehensible promos given between matches by the stars of the day. You got a few extra match types here as well. Tag team mode was added, you were able to fight it out in a steel cage, and there was a weapons match. Now, critically, aside from the Game Boy version, it got over fairly well. It scored mostly 7s or 8s. I think looking back on it, people aren't quite as keen on it now due to how tricky it can be to pull off the moves. It's something I don't remember having much of an issue with at the time, but I was the sort of person who would pore over the instruction manuals and study the move list. But I can admit it doesn't have the flaw that many of the later titles do have. 1998 would come and go, and WWF was going from strength to strength. Raw was must-watch television, helped by an absolute parade of stars that captured the imaginations of fans worldwide. It was in early January that WWF would score a critical ratings victory against WCW Nitro, as fans would see Mick Foley, then as Mankind, overcome The Rock, and win the WWF Championship for the first time. WCW just couldn't beat WWF in the ratings again from that moment on, up until the closure of the company in 2001. The Attitude Era was in full swing, and that brings us, of course, to our next game, WWF Attitude. Now, I do remember this as being one of the very first games that I was massively hyped for. I was so excited to see him play this. I poured over whatever information I could in PlayStation magazines back then, and if I could see any online, I'd look at that. The game would release in mid-1999 after being delayed a little bit due to the tragic passing of Owen Hart. It was released on the PlayStation, the N64, Dreamcast, and the Game Boy Color. Now this was a year in which the Offspring would tell us about someone who's pretty fly for a white guy, the Backstreet Boys wanted it that way, Lou Bega wanted a little bit of everyone, and Cliff Bloody Richard resurfaced to see the year out. The album of the year, again, no personal bias here, scenes from memory and a dream fever. But let's get back to the game. Attitude would kind of take what had been done Warzone and expand on it massively. Used kind of the same gameplay style in a few moves, but it also added expanded creation options. We could create a stable now, and there's a feature that I absolutely loved back then, the ability to create your own. As with Warzone, I expect there was a lot of nostalgia talking here, but I absolutely loved Attitude, and it is really hard for me to play it without smiling. And again, I'll admit, pulling off the moves can be a little bit awkward due to it being all these different combinations per wrestler. You'll be consulting that move list all the time, but to me it did feel like Attitude had taken what Warzone had done and just made it better. With the Create a Wrestler, it had so many more features. You could play around with a lot more. You could set up your entrances properly. You had create your own move sets, which was quite amusing at times because you could just create a move set full of finishing moves. You had the addition of the Create Pay-Per-View, which I just mentioned before. It was quite basic and rudimentary, but you could create these dream cards, you could name them, you could create colours for your ring and your arena. We saw these new match types being added as well. First Blood, I Quit, Last Man Standing, Falls Count Anywhere. And then we saw a hugely expanded roster, which was pretty much everyone in WWF at the time. You had Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Triple H, but you had up-and-comers, your mid-carders, people like Val Venus, Steve Blackman, D'Lo Brown. It was just a complete package of a wrestling game back then. Now, when it came to the critics, it seemed that they rated the PS1 version the highest. They weren't quite as keen on the N64 version, the Dreamcast one for some reason, sorry. The Dreamcast version scored the lowest via game ratings, 54%, the PS1 version scoring 79%. The turn of the new millennium, WWF was still going strong and it was consistently beating WCW by this point. 2000 would actually be the last full year WCW would be in operation. By this time, WWF was flying incredibly high and it started to introduce a brand new show off of the back of one of The Rock's catchphrases. Enter WWF Smackdown. So, new millennium, new show, new developer. Acclaim was out and Ukes THQ were in. Musically, Britney Spears had done it again. U2 thought it was a beautiful day. Song with significant wrestling history, as it was very famously used in hype packages for returning Triple H in 2002. There's this bloke called Eminem who wanted us to know that he was indeed the real Slim Shady. And of course, how can I mention 2000 without mentioning Kid Rock and Limp Bizkit, who would provide the theme songs for a returning Undertaker who had a brand new gimmick. Smackdown was a radical change from Attitude, and in many ways it was a huge step forward. Gone was the awkward control system of Warzone and Attitude in favour of a more simplified system. You held a direction and you pressed a button to pull off moves based on the context. Finishers had been changed up. In the previous ones, you would have to fight your opponent until their life appeared to be in the red, and then you could pull off your finisher. Now what would happen is as the match went on, you did taunts or whatever, you could build up a bar and then you could store your finisher and use it later if you tapped L1 when they were in the right spot. Smackdown was released in early 2000. It featured a vast roster of stars at the time, also a variety of match types from your single match to hardcore, and it introduced things like the Royal Rumble, Anywhere Falls, and Special Referee. And one of the cool things about the Anywhere Falls matches was the ability to select a different part of the backstage area to have your match. Also introduced with Smackdown were videos playing during your entrances. There's a little bit of a trade-off because Attitude actually kind of shown full entrances coming down to the ring. They didn't always look amazing, but they were there. but you didn't see like the video playing in the background. Smackdown, you would see the video playing in the background, but they'd just kind of walk out in front of the video, do a few of their taunts, and then it would go on. But seeing that was a bit of a step up, and it was really cool. Now, what wasn't so much of a step up was the Creator Wrestler, which, when I played it for this video, it felt like a massive backward step. Didn't seem to be as many options on offer as Attitude had, and similarly, the Creator pay-per-view was very stripped back, offering far fewer options than Attitude was. But it's really about the gameplay here, and whilst I do like and did get on with Warzone and Attitude, Smackdown is still a bigger step up. It feels much more fluid, it's easier to get into the action. There might not have been as many moves to pull off during the match, but it was more satisfying to pull them off, and it wasn't so obtuse to do something like Irish whipping your opponent. Changing the way the finisher worked was a much more novel idea as well, allowing you to store your finishers and use them later on. And you have built up a bit earlier by taunting. It kind of gave a bit more unpredictability to your match. I really did like SmackDown. It was, it was a big step up, and it did feel like this series, these wrestling games were starting to evolve and maybe become more like what you'd see on TV. Critically, the game did very well as well. It was only released on the PlayStation. Other platforms got their own unique games, and this one scored quite highly, getting mostly 8s and 9s. So let us now fast forward a few more months towards the end of 2000, and we see the release of WWF Smackdown 2. That's right, not only did we see the debut effort of a new partnership for WWF in terms of video games, but we also saw the second game in that franchise come out in the same year. I'm not really sure what the circumstances were around the game's development, but that is quite a short turnaround for a game. Now, I remember being incredibly hyped for SmackDown 2. I was in secondary school at this point. Wrestling was still huge. It showed no signs of slowing down. And SmackDown 2 was seen as a big deal. It definitely was to me. And that was in no small part to the fact that I was getting older. I was getting more into reading gaming websites, poring over news and information, looking at previews and gaming mags, and seeing kind of how the game was coming along and what it was to feature. I saw things like the expanded match lists in advance. I saw the roster. I saw the changes to the creation suite from SmackDown 1. And all I knew is how much I wanted this game. And let me tell you, back then, it really didn't disappoint. Much like Attitude had taken what Warzone had done and expanded upon it, SmackDown 2 took the groundwork laid down by the first one and improved upon that massively. The new match types were great, and for me back then, it was all about getting to play the Hell in a Cell match. It was so primitive for the time, but that didn't matter because you could throw your opponent out of the ring, you could take them up on top of the cage and throw them off, just like we'd seen happen to Mick Foley back in 1998. The Creator Wrestler feature saw significant improvements as well. It allowed for much more customization in comparison to the first one, more tuning of your wrestler's personality, and that could feed into the career mode, which allowed you to play through, various years. You were given some basic choices, and you'd see cutscenes play out every now and then, like a wrestler being run down in the parking lot, or you could unlock wrestlers through cutscenes. They might interfere in a match, or you might see a version of Stone Cold dropping a DX Express like it happened in television at the time. You'd also unlock new parts for your wrestler to use at a later point. So I spent so much time playing this one. I loved it. And even to this day, I think it ranks as one of my favourite wrestling games. And revisiting it was really fun. I couldn't quite figure out how to do certain things, like with the cell. It did feel a little bit awkward to play at points, but I haven't played it in like over a decade. But for me, this game back then really lived up to the hype, and it might not hold up as well as other titles do now, but it holds such a special place in my heart. Critically, did really well too. It managed to get over 90% on Metacritic, so just a really, really good game. So there we have it. It's really interesting for me to travel back through time and experience all of these games. Some of them I was experiencing for the first time, and others for the very first time in a long while. It was really interesting to see how the rosters changed and grew over time, how the voices and style of WF changed over time, going from that middle of the new generation era to the dizzying heights of the Attitude era. It's remarkable to see how over the course of 6 games we got 3 very different play styles. I really hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. Please do feel free to leave comments below what your favourite wrestling games are, or what they were. What's your experience with wrestling in general? Are you a lapsed fan? Do you still watch now? What do you watch? Were you WWF or WCW back in the day? And speaking of WCW, there were a large number of WCW games made for the PlayStation 1 as well, which I will be covering them in a future video, so make sure you do like the video, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell for notifications so you can see that when it arrives, and do feel free to check out the rest of the content on the channel. And until next time, in the words of Mick Foley, have a nice day.